In the dense forests of upstate New York, 133 unmarked graves were uncovered in 1862 beneath the rotting floorboards of a long-abandoned church. Local authorities documented that each skeleton bore signs of systematic torture, limbs fractured and healed before death, evidence of repeated near-drowning, and strange symbols etched into the bones themselves. For over 160 years, all federal documentation concerning the Church of the Pure Spirit remained sealed, accessible only to those with high-level clearance. I have obtained previously unreleased records, files that reveal how 3 brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencraft, led hundreds of followers into a nightmare of religious extremism. Their doctrine of salvation through suffering culminated in what may be the most disturbing religious cult in American history. The story begins in Ravenwood, a small isolated settlement in upstate New York. Located some 40 miles north of Albany, the town was like many others of the time, quiet, agricultural, and God-fearing. Founded in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley, Ravenwood thrived modestly through farming, timber work, and local trade. In the early 19th century, however, this region found itself at the heart of the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense religious revivalism. It was known as the Burned-Over District, a landscape scorched with spiritual fervor. Old denominations waned, while new sects caught fire. Charismatic preachers drew crowds in the thousands, and doctrines both bizarre and compelling took root in fertile minds. It was into this volatile spiritual landscape that the Ravencraft brothers arrived in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, carried the weight and presence of a man accustomed to obedience. His eyes, nearly black in certain light, gave the unsettling impression of seeing through flesh and into spirit. Deacon Silas, age 39, was quieter, more scholarly, with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed spectacles, perpetually writing theological tracts. The youngest, Prophet Caleb, just 35, possessed an otherworldly aura. His pale blue eyes often rolled back during supposed visions, and his whispered voice somehow carried through even the most crowded rooms. Arriving with unexpected wealth, the brothers purchased a vast tract of land on the edge of Ravenwood and began building their church, an edifice unlike anything seen in the region. The Church of the Pure Spirit was constructed not of wood, but dark stone quarried from the nearby hills. The central sanctuary was octagonal, encircled by 8 smaller chambers. Towering above the forest, a sharp steeple pierced the sky. Most curious of all was the lack of windows. Inside the main chamber, light came only from carefully placed lanterns. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra proclaimed at the church's first gathering, which drew a curious crowd despite the townspeople's initial suspicion. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message, purification through tribulation." Their timing was impeccable. By 1825, American Christianity was fragmented. Traditional churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, were losing influence. Methodists and Baptists surged forward with emotional, revivalist services. New religions, like the Mormons, were just emerging. Joseph Smith would publish the Book of Mormon less than 5 years later and less than 100 miles away. In this atmosphere of upheaval, the Ravencraft doctrine took root. Their message seemed simple: only through suffering could one be saved. They cited scripture about refinement by fire and the crucifixion as evidence. But unlike other preachers, they meant it literally. Suffering wasn't symbolic, it was essential. The flesh is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas often preached. Therefore the flesh must be tested, tried and purified through pain. Only when the body is broken can the spirit rise. Their following grew. New members were interviewed personally by Prophet Caleb, who judged their fitness for purification. 3 groups predominated among the early converts: the impoverished, desperate for purpose; the psychologically wounded, seeking redemption; and the wealthy, craving spiritual novelty. One early follower was Margaret Wilkins, a grieving widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever.
He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts. She later wrote of Elder Ezra. He told me my suffering was not for nothing, that it was preparing me. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. By 1827, the church had nearly 100 followers. Some built homes near the church, others lived in Ravenwood, but spent most of their time on the compound. The Ravencrofts urged members to donate their savings and property, warning that worldly attachments were barriers to spiritual elevation. The most devoted became vessels of the Spirit, a status that required participation in more intense rituals. At first, these were mild, prolonged fasting, prayer vigils, immersion in icy water symbolizing the drowning of the sinful self. But gradually, the rituals darkened. What outsiders didn't see was how calculated this transformation was. Like frogs in slowly boiling water, the faithful were conditioned to accept escalating cruelty in the name of purity. By 1829, the brothers had begun digging a complex system of chambers beneath the church. By then, they controlled not only the actions of their followers but their thoughts, their pain, even their bodies. Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a meeting years later, documented by federal investigators, "The sheep are gathered, now begins the shepherd's true work." But for the Ravencrofts, shepherd meant not protector, but sacrificer. The turning point came on December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice, the year's longest night. It would later be remembered in secret church records as the First Ascension. That morning, Elder Ezra announced that Caleb had received a divine revelation. Every member of the congregation was summoned to the church for a new level of purification. As night fell and temperatures plunged below freezing, nearly 150 followers packed into the windowless sanctuary. The only illumination came from 12 large candles, each placed at a point in a massive spiral carved into the wooden floor. At its center stood a raised platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith and member of 6 Months, would later escape and provide the only known eyewitness account of what happened next.
According to Hartford, Elder Ezra addressed the congregation with unusual intensity, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he declared that their previous purification rituals had only been preparatory steps toward a true cleansing. He proclaimed, "We have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding, but the Spirit grows impatient with our progress." He then announced that Prophet Caleb had been shown the true path to salvation, one that required far greater courage than had yet been demanded. At that moment, Prophet Caleb emerged from a side chamber, appearing transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and his eyes rolled back to reveal only the whites. Speaking in what he claimed was the tongue of angels, he uttered guttural sounds and high-pitched wails that echoed through the sanctuary. After several minutes, he collapsed. When he rose again, he spoke in his normal voice, though now with a strange cadence and commanding authority. He named 3 individuals, Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, as chosen by the Spirit for the honor of First Ascension. All relatively recent converts, they were led to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed, Hartford described, defied belief. The 3 were stripped to their undergarments despite the bitter cold and bound to wooden frames shaped like inverted crosses. Elder Ezra explained that this inversion symbolized the necessary reversal from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to eventual rebirth. Over the course of several hours, they were subjected to what the brothers called the 7 trials of purification. The trial of air involved waterboarding-like techniques, while the trial of earth saw them buried up to their necks in soil. The trial of fire consisted of pressing heated metal against their skin in specific patterns, and the trial of water included repeated submersion in icy water until unconsciousness. Hartford's testimony grew fragmented during his descriptions of the final 3 trials, admitting he vomited and nearly fainted. What is clear from multiple accounts is that throughout the ordeal, the victims were urged to embrace their suffering as divine. When they screamed, the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Hartford noted that while some members wept or looked away, many watched in awe, their faces filled with reverence or ecstasy, evidence of years of psychological conditioning equating pain with spiritual advancement.
Near dawn, the three victims, barely conscious, hung limp on their frames. Elder Ezra declared them cleansed of sin and ready to receive the pure spirit. Prophet Caleb then placed his hands on each of their heads, whispering into their ears. Witnesses reported that the victims suddenly convulsed, their bodies arching violently, bones audibly breaking. Their eyes flew open, bloodshot and bulging, and they began to speak in the same strange tongue used earlier by Caleb. By sunrise, all three were dead. Ezra proclaimed their ascension successful and claimed their souls had bypassed judgment, entering heaven directly. Their corpses, now considered holy relics, were placed on stone slabs in newly constructed subterranean chambers beneath the church, where members could pray before them. These were the first of what would later become hundreds of preserved bodies in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The next morning, some members fled Ravenwood in horror, Hartford among them, unable to speak of what they had witnessed. Those who remained grew more devoted. The Ravencrofters had crossed into ritual murder, and their control over their flock only deepened. Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers afterward, "Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now." This chilling declaration proved true. The first ascension was only the beginning of 3 decades of escalating atrocities, hidden behind a mask of spiritual devotion. Between 1830 and 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined their theological justifications and ritual techniques for what they called elevations, though these were in truth ritualized killings. Maintaining a respectable public image, they emphasized charity and spiritual renewal, participating in religious revivals, and donating to causes like temperance and orphanages. Privately, their operations grew more sinister. The initial cellars beneath the church expanded into a complex network of tunnels and ritual chambers, constructed by loyal followers known as vessels of the spirit. By 1835, these catacombs included 7 major chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves, each with a specific function: preparation, trial, ascension, and the most disturbing, the Chamber of Saints, where the preserved corpses of the ascended were kept. Unlike other religions that buried their dead, the Ravencroftovans embalmed or reduced bodies to skeletons, arranging them in reverent postures using wire and chemicals. Elizabeth Carver, a former member, described how new initiates were gradually exposed to these horrors, first symbolically, then directly, until they accepted the macabre as divine. She recalled weeping with religious ecstasy upon first seeing the Chamber of Saints, only later recognizing her tears as products of indoctrination. As the years passed, elevations became more frequent. By 1835, they occurred quarterly. By 1840, monthly, with larger events on solstices and equinoxes. At first, the victims were orphans, widows, and the unconnected. Later, entire families offered their children, viewing it as the ultimate act of faith. Elder Ezra remained the public leader, Deacon Silas the theological mind, and Prophet Caleb the mystical visionary. But over time, Caleb's influence dominated. By 1840, he alone chose who would be elevated and how. His journals grew increasingly erratic, mixing religious ramblings with anatomical sketches. One entry claimed the soul existed in nodes throughout the body, and that each elevation brought him closer to mapping the divine anatomy. As the church grew to 300 members by 1845, the brothers faced a practical issue: how to dispose of so many bodies. The solution was grotesque and effective. They began selling corpses to medical schools. At the time, medical colleges faced a shortage of cadavers, with legal sources limited to executed criminals. A black market existed, fed by grave robbers. Deacon Silas, leveraging his academic contacts, established ties with agents supplying institutions from Albany to Philadelphia. Between 1840 and 1845, at least 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of science, a euphemism for murdered victims' bodies sold as anatomical specimens. This commerce served multiple purposes. It eliminated evidence, funded the church, and further blurred the line between spiritual and scientific corruption.
By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had transformed from an obscure sect into something far more insidious, a self-sustaining system of indoctrination, ritual murder, and profit, all cloaked in the guise of spiritual enlightenment. Deacon Silas, drawing from his dealings with medical institutions, had learned techniques for preserving bodies and inflicting pain without leaving visible marks. These macabre skills elevated the church's rituals to new levels of cruelty and secrecy. Despite their careful efforts to appear respectable, whispers of the church's true nature began to spread. The sheer number of followers who had vanished after joining the congregation raised suspicions. Those who escaped the church rarely spoke openly, silenced by fear and trauma, but their haunted eyes and evasive answers only fueled local rumors. It wasn't until a postal inspector named James Thornhill stumbled onto financial discrepancies in 1847 that official scrutiny began. His investigation revealed large cash deposits tied to the church and vague financial ties to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, donations it seemed paid in blood. Thornhill's inquiry might have remained purely financial, if not for a chance meeting with Martha Simmons, a former member who had fled after witnessing her sister's so-called elevation. At first hesitant, Simmons ultimately gave Thornhill a chilling testimony of torture rituals, missing children, and underground chambers where the sacred and the profane merged. Her claims were almost unbelievable until Thornhill saw they matched the banking anomalies he'd already uncovered. Though he reported his findings, authorities were hesitant to act against a religious body, citing protections under the banner of religious freedom. With no official mandate, Thornhill pressed on in secret, building a network of informants around Ravenwood. One such contact was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany. Garrett had grown uneasy about cadavers he received from the Church of the Pure Spirit. The bodies showed signs of trauma inflicted before death, bruises that had begun to heal, repeated signs of asphyxiation, and a disturbing consistency in the causes of death. In 1850, Garrett discreetly passed detailed medical reports on 7 such bodies to Thornhill. It was the first clinical proof that something terrible was taking place. Still, without a definitive criminal act or confession, no action was taken. That changed in the spring of 1851, when Prophet Caleb Ravencraft's mind finally shattered. Witnesses from inside the church later testified that Caleb had become erratic and paranoid, screaming about spirits crawling from the walls and divine anatomy appearing in the air. His sermons turned wild and terrifying, even to his most loyal followers. In response, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas withdrew Caleb from public view, claiming he was in deep spiritual communion. In reality, they locked him in a soundproof cell buried deep within the underground chambers. There he remained, hidden until the night of June 17th, when he escaped. Caleb fled through the catacombs and surfaced in the nearby woods, eventually staggering into Ravenwood's town square, naked, bloodied and raving. It was the night of the community's summer planting festival. Before stunned townsfolk, he declared himself the living vessel of the pure spirit. He described in horrifying detail the secret rites of the church. The blood of the purified binds us to the divine. He shouted, 27 vessels emptied, and their essence fills me. Beneath the soil lie the sacred dead, and soon you too shall join them in glorious suffering. Caleb was quickly detained, initially believed to be a madman, but when he identified himself as one of the Ravencraft brothers, his words took on chilling weight. Authorities notified Thornhill immediately. He arrived the next day and interviewed Caleb, who oscillated between mute despair and manic confessions. In those frenzied moments, Caleb confirmed every dark suspicion Thornhill had ever held, and more. The reckoning had finally begun. Prophet Caleb's maps and detailed confessions corroborated testimony from former members. Most critically, he identified hidden entrances and the precise layout of the subterranean chambers, including the so-called Chamber of Saints, where victims' remains were displayed in grotesque devotion. Armed with this damning evidence, Postal Inspector James Thornhill finally obtained authorization for an official federal investigation, but word of Caleb's arrest reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas before authorities could act. What followed revealed the brothers' terrifying readiness for disaster. Within hours, they activated a contingency plan, ominously referred to in internal records as the Cleansing Flame. Inner Circle members were dispatched to purge the underground chambers, removing incriminating documents, dismembering and relocating the most recent corpses, and burning select archives. They then orchestrated a controlled fire within the church building. Flames were carefully set to destroy only strategic areas, giving the appearance of a tragic accident rather than deliberate evidence destruction. When authorities arrived on June 19, 1851, they found the charred ruins of the sanctuary and a congregation already engaged in cleanup efforts. Elder Ezra met them with a facade of humility and cooperation. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly said. "First with my brother's troubled mind, and now this terrible fire, but faith must rise from ashes." Despite the brothers' calculated performance, investigators quickly encountered anomalies. The main tunnel entrance had collapsed in the blaze. When excavation crews managed to reopen access, they found portions of the underground complex flooded, deliberately so, with water rerouted from a nearby stream. Many chambers were hastily emptied, but enough evidence remained to validate Caleb's confession. In undamaged rooms, authorities discovered surgical tools modified for torture, restraints designed to hold victims upright for extended periods, and embalming chemicals. Most damning was the Chamber of Saints. Dozens of human remains were uncovered, some skeletal, others partially preserved, arranged in horrific tableaus, kneeling, seated in pews, or posed as if mid-sermon. Small sealed niches revealed the bodies of children, positioned in simulated play, but bearing unmistakable signs of violence. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood later wrote, "The scene defies language. We found death not only ritualized, but sanctified, structured with an almost clerical precision. It was a place of worship built on flesh." Public outcry exploded after details, sanitized for Victorian sensibilities, leaked to the press. The Albany Evening Journal ran the now infamous headline, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House, Brothers Accused of Unspeakable Acts in God's Name." Despite overwhelming suspicion, Ezra and Silas claimed ignorance. They insisted Caleb had acted alone, concealing his actions from church leadership. This defense began to falter when investigators found a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath Silas's private chambers. The book, written in his distinctive handwriting, catalogued every elevation from 1829 to 1851. It included names, dates, methods used, and what became of each body, including notes about remains sold to medical schools. Worse still, the ledger detailed the participation of all three brothers, with Elder Ezra identified as the one who selected worthy candidates for ascension. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas were arrested on charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. Caleb, deemed mentally unfit, was committed to the Utica State Lunatic Asylum. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational of the 19th century. While much of the horror was suppressed to preserve public morality, investigators continued uncovering even deeper layers of depravity. As the inquiry expanded, Daniel Blackwood and his team discovered the Ravenwood site was just the culmination of a broader operation. Evidence pointed to earlier settlements in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio dating back to 1817. In each, the Ravencroft brothers, using aliases, established religious enclaves, preyed on the vulnerable, and vanished before suspicion caught up with them. Recovered records showed a deliberate evolution of method. Ravenwood was simply the final iteration of a system refined over decades, religious dogma constructed not merely to control but to justify systematic human experimentation. Letters found in Silas's quarters revealed disturbing relationships with several medical institutions. One letter from a Philadelphia anatomist in 1844 praised the quality of specimens, noting, "These subjects show signs of controlled anatomical distress. It's as though the bodies were prepared for our studies before death." This correspondence shattered any illusion of ignorance among some medical buyers. The Ravencroft brothers weren't simply fanatics. They were proto-scientific researchers using faith to facilitate inhumane trials. Dr. Samuel Prescott of Albany Medical College reviewed the evidence, stating, "The injuries show calculated experimentation, designed to measure pain tolerance, organ failure, and survival under extreme trauma. This was primitive biomedical research masked as sacrament." The breakthrough came in August 1851, when Dr. Jonathan Crane of Boston recognized Silas Ravencroft as a former visiting lecturer he had encountered at Harvard Medical School in the 1820s under the name Simon Ravenwood. Crane remembered him promoting disturbing theories linking pain, religious ecstasy, and spiritual transformation, ideas dismissed at the time as academic madness. The realization that Ravenwood and Ravencroft were the same person reframed the entire Church of the Pure Spirit, not as a cult, but as a laboratory.
Investigators then uncovered a hidden archive beneath Silas's chambers, hundreds of notebooks filled with anatomical drawings, procedural observations, and clinical data. The language became less spiritual over time, more methodical and medical. One chilling entry read, Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes post-excision, vocalization patterns consistent with Trial 6, blood loss estimated at 1.7 liters, hypothesis on systemic function post-organ trauma confirmed. When confronted with this evidence, Elder Ezra abandoned his pious mask. According to transcripts, he burst into laughter before sneering at investigators. "You understand nothing. Call it God. Call it science. We sought knowledge others feared. Our followers were not victims. They were vessels of understanding. Their suffering meant something." Shockwaves rippled through the medical community. Institutions that had unknowingly or willfully accepted the Ravencroft-Off's research faced scrutiny, forcing a reckoning over ethical standards in medical education. As the excavation continued through the autumn of 1851, initial estimates of 217 victims based on Caleb's confession proved tragically low. By September, at least 276 individual remains had been identified. Soil analysis and structural expansion suggested more graves beneath adjacent properties. The underground complex had been expanding outward, hidden beneath the town itself. Finally, letters uncovered in nearby communities revealed the most disturbing truth of all. Not all victims had been followers. The brothers had coordinated the abduction of drifters, immigrants, and the socially invisible. One letter read chillingly, "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday will make an excellent vessel. No family, strong build. I've directed him to Ravenwood with promise of millwork. Expect him by Saturday." The Church of the Pure Spirit, once seen as a symbol of moral clarity, was exposed as a grotesque blend of fanaticism, scientific ambition, and predation. The full scope of its darkness, however, would take decades to fully comprehend, and some truths remain buried still.
This evidence transformed understanding of the case, from one of religious extremism preying on willing followers to something closer to organized abduction and murder for both profit and pseudoscientific research. The implications were disturbing, not only for the scale of the brothers' crimes, but for the suggestion of a wider network of complicity. Just when it seemed that the full horror of Ravenwood had been revealed, the darkness only deepened. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The breakthrough that would ultimately reveal the full extent of the Ravencroft operation came in October 1851, when investigators located Samuel Parsons, who had served as the church's accountant from 1835 to 1849 before being replaced by a newer member. Parsons had been living under an assumed name in Western Massachusetts, having fled the church after discovering the true purpose of certain financial transactions. "I believed I was managing donations and legitimate business interests," Parsons testified after being granted immunity. "When I discovered entries for specimen preparation and research grants that corresponded with disappearances among the congregation, I began keeping private records. When Elder Ezra discovered my separate ledger, I was scheduled for special prayer counseling, a term I had learned meant selection for elevation. I fled that night with only the clothes on my back." Parsons provided investigators with detailed financial information from memory, including names of medical institutions that had paid for bodies and research, wealthy patrons who had funded the brothers' work believing it to be legitimate scientific inquiry, and church members who had assisted in various aspects of the operation. Most significantly, he revealed the existence of a second facility located nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood, a remote farmhouse that the brothers had purchased through an intermediary in 1840. According to Parsons, this location was used for special research kept secret even from the church's inner circle. Elder Ezra called it the Garden. Parsons recalled, "Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered monthly, medical equipment, chemicals, specialized restraints, and occasionally selected subjects were transported there, always at night. None ever returned. When authorities located and searched the farmhouse, what they discovered exceeded even the horrors found beneath the church. The building had been converted into a sophisticated research facility with rooms designed for different types of experiments. Detailed records indicated that this location had been used primarily for long-term studies, with subjects kept alive for weeks or months while various procedures were performed and documented. Most disturbing was evidence that the brothers had been particularly interested in the effects of their purification techniques on children. A separate building on the property contained small cells and equipment sized for juvenile subjects. Records indicated that at least 37 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16, had been held at the facility between 1840 and 1851. This discovery galvanized public outrage like nothing before. Newspapers that had been relatively restrained in their coverage now published lurid details, with the New York Tribune running the headline, "Monsters in Human Form, Ravencroft of Brothers' Crimes Against Innocents Revealed." Public demonstrations demanded swift justice, and political pressure mounted for an exemplary prosecution. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas, who had maintained a certain composure throughout earlier phases of the investigation, reportedly showed signs of breaking under the accumulated evidence. Prison guards noted that Elder Ezra had begun speaking to invisible presences in his cell, while Deacon Silas attempted suicide after being confronted with evidence from the garden. As 1851 drew to a close, the case against the Ravencroft of brothers had grown from a local horror to a national sensation. The upcoming trial promised to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in American history, with implications not only for the defendants but for religious freedom, medical ethics, and the dark capabilities that could hide behind respectable facades. Yet even as preparations for the trial progressed, investigator Blackwood remained troubled by lingering questions. The brothers' activities had spanned too many years and locations to have gone completely undetected. Their connections to medical institutions and wealthy patrons suggested a level of protection that seemed implausible without some form of official complicity. The sophistication of their operation indicated resources beyond what church donations alone could provide. "I am increasingly convinced that we have uncovered merely the visible portion of something far more extensive," Blackwood wrote in his personal journal in December 1851. "The Ravencrofts are undoubtedly guilty of unconscionable crimes, but I cannot escape the suspicion that they were part of a larger enterprise, one that may continue to operate despite their apprehension. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served in this case, but whether the full truth will ever come to light." His concerns would prove prophetic in ways he could not have anticipated as the trial of the century prepared to begin in Albany in January 1852. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft began on January 12, 1852 in Albany, New York. Amid unprecedented security and public interest, the courthouse was surrounded daily by crowds numbering in the thousands, some traveling from as far as Boston and Philadelphia to witness proceedings in what newspapers dubbed the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented a methodical case that unfolded over 6 weeks. More than 100 witnesses provided testimony about various aspects of the Ravencroft Ace crimes. Survivors of the church described the psychological manipulation and gradual indoctrination that led them to accept increasingly extreme purification rituals. Medical experts detailed their examinations of recovered remains, confirming patterns of systematic torture and experimentation. Financial records demonstrated the brothers' profit from selling bodies and research. The most powerful testimony came from families of victims, who described their loved ones' gradual transformation under the brothers' influence, ending with their disappearance or suspicious death. Sarah Wilkinson, whose daughter Emma had joined the church in 1847 at age 16 and ascended 6 months later, spoke of receiving letters in her daughter's handwriting that grew increasingly strange before stopping entirely. The final letter said she had been selected for a special blessing and that I should rejoice in her coming elevation, Wilkinson testified. "When I traveled to Ravenwood to see her, Elder Ezra told me she had been transported to their retreat for spiritual preparation and would not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he informed me she had ascended to the pure spirit during a sacred ceremony. I was not permitted to see her body, which he claimed had been sanctified, and could not leave church grounds." Throughout the proceedings, the defendants' behaviors diverged dramatically. Deacon Silas appeared withdrawn, rarely making eye contact and speaking only to his attorneys in whispers. Elder Ezra, however, maintained an unsettling composure, often smiling during the most damning testimony and occasionally nodding as though in approval of the descriptions of his crimes. When the defense finally presented its case in late February, their strategy became clear. They would not deny the deaths or even many of the practices described, but would instead argue that the activities of the Church of the Pure Spirit were protected religious expression and that members had participated voluntarily.
The Constitution of these United States guarantees freedom of religious practice. Defense attorney William Hargrove argued, the ceremonies of the Church of the Pure Spirit, while perhaps shocking to conventional sensibilities, were conducted with the full knowledge and consent of participants who shared the Ravencrofters' belief in purification through suffering. This defense collapsed under cross-examination of former church members who testified to coercion, deception, and the administration of substances now identified as containing opium and other mind-altering compounds. The final blow came when the prosecution presented records from the garden, clearly showing that many victims had been abducted rather than recruited. On March 20, 1852, with the trial moving toward its inevitable conclusion, Elder Ezra made a request that would transform the proceedings. He asked to testify in his own defense, against the strong advice of his attorneys. The judge, after considerable deliberation, allowed it. What followed was perhaps the most chilling courtroom testimony in American judicial history. For nearly 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke without notes, delivering what amounted to a sermon on his beliefs and practices. He neither denied the charges nor expressed remorse, but instead offered a coherent, if terrifying, philosophy that combined religious mysticism with scientific rationalism in service of what he called the elevation of humanity through systematic understanding of transcendence. Death comes to all, he told the stunned courtroom. We merely gave it purpose. Those who ascended through our ministrations contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit all mankind. Their suffering was temporary, their contribution eternal. Most disturbing was his clear intellectual capacity and the systematic way he had constructed a belief system to justify atrocity. He spoke of pain as the purest form of consciousness, of death as merely a transition of energy, and of his victims as willing participants in the greatest scientific and spiritual endeavor of our age. When prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children found at the garden, Elder Ezra's response sent audible gasps through the courtroom. The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely. Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. We honored them by allowing their suffering to illuminate paths others fear to tread. At this statement, a man in the gallery, later identified as Harold Winters, whose son had disappeared after attending a church service in 1847, rushed toward the witness stand with a concealed knife. He was restrained by court officers before reaching Elder Ezra, who had not flinched or attempted to move. You see, Elder Ezra remarked calmly after Winters had been removed, even now the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it. This has always been the response to those who push beyond conventional boundaries of knowledge and belief. After Elder Ezra's testimony, Deacon Silas declined to take the stand. His attorney offered only a brief statement suggesting that his client had been under his brother's influence and requested mercy on those grounds. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the calculated nature of the brothers' crimes, the suffering of their victims, and the betrayal of both religious faith and scientific principle their actions represented. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. On March 10, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced the Ravencroft brothers to death by hanging, declaring their crimes an offense against God, humanity, and the moral foundation upon which civilized society rests. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but events would take an unexpected turn in the intervening weeks. Prophet Caleb, who had been confined to the asylum at Utica, died under mysterious circumstances on March 20. Official reports stated he had succumbed to nervous exhaustion, but rumors suggested either suicide or murder by attendants who had learned of his connection to the notorious case. More significantly, on the night of April 7, a fire broke out in the Albany jail where the Ravencroft brothers were being held. By the time the blaze was controlled, 3 inmates and 2 guards had died from smoke inhalation. Initial reports indicated that Deacon Silas was among the dead, his body identified by distinctive rings he wore. Elder Ezra, however, was not found among either the dead or the survivors. The manhunt that followed was the largest in New York State history to that point. Federal authorities joined local law enforcement in searching for the escaped prisoner, with wanted posters distributed throughout the Northeast. Reported sightings came from as far away as Chicago and Montreal, but none led to capture. As weeks passed without success, troubling questions emerged about the circumstances of the jail fire and Deacon Silas's death. The official identification had been made hastily, based primarily on personal effects rather than clear recognition of the badly burned body. Some investigators, including Blackwood, questioned whether either brother had actually died in the fire. The timing and nature of the incident suggest planning and outside assistance, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report. The possibility must be considered that both brothers escaped, with one corpse misidentified as Deacon Silas while another prisoner remains unaccounted for in the confusion. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that a substantial sum, nearly $30,000, had been withdrawn from a bank account connected to the church just 2 days before the fire by an individual matching the description of Jacob Thornton, one of the...
The most disturbing development came in June 1852, when a physician in Baltimore was found murdered in his home under bizarre circumstances. Dr. Edward Mitchell had been one of the medical professionals implicated in receiving specimens from the Church of the Pure Spirit. Though he had cooperated with authorities and avoided prosecution, his body was discovered positioned in a manner identical to the elevated victims from the church. A note pinned to his chest read simply, "The Spirit sees all who betray its work." This killing, followed by similar murders of 2 other physicians with connections to the case over the next year, suggested that the brothers or their followers were systematically eliminating those who had assisted the investigation. Each victim was found arranged in the same ritual posture, each with a similar note, creating a wave of fear among those involved in the case. By 1854, the active investigation had been scaled back, with Elder Ezra presumed to have fled the country. Occasional reports of religious groups with practices reminiscent of the Church of the Pure Spirit emerged in places as distant as New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco, but none led to the recapture of the infamous preacher. Blackwood, though reassigned to other cases, continued to investigate the Ravencrofts privately. He became convinced that Elder Ezra had not merely escaped, but had reconstituted his operation in a new location, perhaps with the assistance of a network of followers more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft case represents not the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its exposure, he wrote in his final report before retiring in 1860. He warned that the combination of religious fervor, scientific curiosity without moral constraint, and the promise of transcendent knowledge creates a powerful allure that did not die with the prosecution of 2 of its practitioners. "I fear we have merely driven this darkness further into the shadows, where it continues its work beyond our sight." His assessment would prove prophetic. In the decades that followed, scattered reports emerged of religious groups bearing striking similarities to the Church of the Pure Spirit. These groups appeared briefly before disappearing again, often leaving unexplained disappearances in their wake. None were directly linked to Elder Ezra Ravencroft, yet the pattern suggested his influence lived on. The most significant such incident occurred in 1862, a decade after the original case, when a small church calling itself the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was discovered abandoned near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Local authorities investigating reports of strange noises and lights found an empty building with a hidden cellar containing evidence of recent ritual activity consistent with the Ravencrofts' practices. Most disturbing was a journal recovered from the site, written in handwriting later confirmed by experts to match Elder Ezra's known script. The final entry, dated just 3 days before the discovery, read, "The work continues as it must. Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the final revelation closer. 100 years from now, when the full truth emerges, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age of understanding. The Spirit is patient. So too must be its servants." Whether this represented Ezra's final testament or merely another disappearance before resurfacing elsewhere remains unknown. No confirmed sighting of him was ever recorded after the Albany jail fire, leaving his ultimate fate one of the great unsolved mysteries of American criminal history. The official investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit and the Ravencroft brothers formally concluded in 1862 with the discovery of the abandoned sanctuary and the journal attributed to Elder Ezra. Federal authorities, stretched thin by the demands of the Civil War, classified the case as resolved despite the lack of certainty regarding Ezra's fate. The physical evidence from Ravenwood and subsequent sites was consolidated in a special archive within the Department of Justice, accessible only to officials with specific authorization. This collection, including journals, ritual implements, financial records, and anatomical drawings, remained largely unexamined for decades, a testament to the government's discomfort with the brothers' legacy. In the communities affected by the Ravencrofts, healing and reconciliation proceeded slowly.
Ravenwood itself never fully recovered. The church property was seized by the state, the buildings demolished, and the land left vacant. Many residents relocated, unwilling to live with the stigma of connection to what newspapers had dubbed the American House of Horror. Those who had lost family members to the brothers' elevations formed a support society that eventually expanded to include survivors of similar experiences elsewhere. This group, initially called the Assembly of Reconciliation and later known simply as the Assembly, dedicated itself to identifying and exposing religious practices that crossed into exploitation or abuse. The most profound and lasting impact of the Ravencroft case emerged in the field of medical ethics. The revelation that respected institutions had benefited from the brothers' crimes prompted the first serious national conversation about the sourcing of cadavers for medical education and the ethical boundaries of research. In 1855, the American Medical Association adopted its first formal code of ethics regarding anatomical specimens, requiring documentation of legal acquisition for all bodies used in teaching or research. This was followed in 1858 by legislation in several states establishing stricter regulation of medical schools and anatomical research facilities. Dr. William Harrison, who had been instrumental in exposing the Ravencrofts' medical ties, became a leading advocate for ethical reform. His 1860 treatise on the moral imperative in scientific inquiry directly addressed the case, arguing that knowledge obtained through cruelty is itself corrupted at its source, and that science divorced from humanity's moral compass leads inevitably to atrocity disguised as progress. The brothers' fusion of religious doctrine and pseudo-scientific research had exposed dangerous vulnerabilities at the intersection of faith, science, and authority, vulnerabilities that American society would continue to grapple with long after the details of their crimes faded from public memory. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, rumors persisted about Elder Ezra's survival. Reported sightings placed him in California mining camps, New Orleans spiritual societies, and even European medical conferences. While none were confirmed, their persistence reflected the deep impression his particular brand of charismatic malevolence had left. More concrete was the evidence of the brothers' continuing influence through followers who had escaped prosecution. Between 1865 and 1890, authorities identified at least 7 small religious groups in different parts of the country that incorporated elements of the Church of the Pure Spirit's doctrine and practices. Though none reached the scale or extremity of the original, their existence suggested the brothers' ideas had taken root beyond their direct control. The most significant such group was discovered in 1879 in rural Missouri, where a charismatic preacher calling himself Brother Elijah had established a small community centered on transcendence through tribulation. Local authorities investigating reports of disturbing activities found ritual implements and journals directly referencing the Ravencrofts. Brother Elijah, later identified as Thomas Whitfield, a former Inner Circle member, took his own life rather than face arrest. The final confirmed chapter of the Ravencroft saga came in 1899, when a collection of papers was anonymously donated to the Harvard Medical School library. The materials, contained in a locked iron box, included extensive journals, anatomical drawings, and experimental notes spanning from 1852 to 1898. Handwriting analysis confirmed the most recent entries were in Elder Ezra's hand, though showing signs of advanced age. As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit, content in knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary, the knowledge remains, the spirit continues. Whether this was genuinely Ezra's final testament or an elaborate hoax was never definitively established. If authentic, it would suggest he survived to the age of 115, an unlikely, though not impossible, longevity. More significant than authorship was the fact that the journals contained detailed protocols and observations that appeared to have influenced legitimate medical research in the early 20th century, suggesting elements of the brothers' work had indeed infiltrated mainstream science. Harvard officials, upon recognizing the nature of the materials, immediately sealed them from public access. In 1902, after consultation with federal authorities, the collection was transferred to a secured government archive, where it remained classified until 1972, when limited access was granted to scholars researching the history of medical ethics. The site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood remained vacant until 1923, when the state of New York designated it a restricted area, fencing the property and posting warnings against trespassing. Local legends claimed the ground was cursed. Stories spread of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and feelings of overwhelming dread experienced by those who ventured too close. In 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the site using modern techniques. They discovered additional human remains in previously unexcavated tunnels, bringing the estimated victim count to over 400, significantly higher than the 276 officially recorded. Most disturbing was the discovery of a sealed chamber containing remarkably well-preserved documents that appeared to outline plans for expanding beyond Ravenwood. These materials suggested the Church of the Pure Spirit had been intended as only the first node in a national and possibly international network, a vision that Elder Ezra may have continued to pursue after his escape. Today, more than 160 years after the Ravencrofters' reign of terror, their legacy persists across multiple fields. In religious studies, they are cited as a case study in how charismatic leadership, incremental normalization of deviance, and the human yearning for transcendence can combine to enable atrocity. In medical ethics, their case underscores the necessity for moral boundaries in scientific inquiry. In criminal psychology, they stand as early examples of organized systematic killers operating under the protection of social institutions. For the families and communities touched by their crimes, however, the Ravencroftofts represent something more personal, a wound in the fabric of American history that has never fully healed. Descendants of victims and survivors still gather annually in a small ceremony at a memorial established in Albany in 1902, bearing the simple inscription, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." How did the brothers develop their fusion of religious control and pseudoscientific experimentation? Who else knew of or enabled their actions? And most disturbingly, how much of their influence persists, hidden within institutions and ideas that continue to shape society? The true horror of the Ravencroftoft case lies not just in the grotesque acts committed, but in the recognition that their story was not an aberration. It was a warning, a dark possibility born from the human capacity for both reverence and cruelty, especially when guided by ideology, authority, and unshakable belief. In the dense forests of upstate New York, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood remains empty. The earth still bears the scars of foundations no time has been able to fully erase. Locals say that even now, on particularly still nights, the air turns silent, as though something in the soil continues to absorb sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the suffering that once fed it so abundantly.